So glad you could make it. Thank you. All right, so we're starting a little bit late, just because we wanted to give people time to make their way in. I received many thank yous from people for choosing this venue for your driving convenience. So you're welcome for that. My name is Mott Smith, and I am on the board of the Council of Infill Builders, an organization that I am passionate about. And I know we've got several board members here right now. There's Kurt Johansson, our president. Is Mia Kong in yet? I think I saw David Mogavero here as well. Did I miss any board members, Ethan? Oh, Keith. Back there. Oh, there you are. Hey, Keith, what's going on? All right, so thank you guys for your service to the organization. Thanks for coming down here today. Everyone in attendance today, this is our first Southern California conference. The organization has been very active in Northern California for many years and has been an important voice, perhaps the most important voice for infill in Sacramento. And this event marks the launch of a broader organizing drive to bring members into the group, people who have on-the-ground experience, who are not only dealing with the challenges of infill, but frankly defining the agenda of the organization, since you guys are the ones in the trenches. And so we really appreciate your coming today and really appreciate your participation. And how many of you have joined as members? Put your hands up. That is fabulous. All right, so for the, yeah. So for the three of you who didn't join, please go into the hallway afterwards. All right, so I quickly want to thank our organization's, I should say our event sponsors today, SOLA Impact Fund, the Environmental Law and Real Property sections of the California Lawyers Association, and the LA County Bar Association Environmental Law section. So thank you to our... UCLA Real Property Law section. Oh, UCLA Real Property Law section. The CLA Real Property Law section. Thank you to our sponsors. All right. I also would like to encourage all of you who are here for those who are still waiting to get into the parking garage or the on-ramp to the 405, tweet as much as you like. When you hear a quote that's fun or exciting or important, snap a picture. The hashtag for this is hashtag LAinfill. And so please do tweet and Instagram wildly. We're not going to be mad at you for using your phones. We all know how important infill is. We know that it really is kind of the challenge of our time, is figuring out how to accommodate growth, how to accommodate more people in a more environmentally sustainable, a more socially vibrant and equitable fashion than we've been doing for years and years. And right now, our system in California and in most of our jurisdictions is built around suburban development. The paradigms are, we're regulating things as though we are building new subdivisions on farms and out in the desert, even if you're building a 4-unit project in the city. And that's what's got to change. And the conversation today is where this begins in Southern California right now. And we have a really great day planned for you guys, and so glad you can participate. I regret that our keynote speaker, Robert Mueller, had to cancel because of something more important in Washington. But we're glad that we've got Senator Wiener, Scott Wiener, who will be addressing us in Mueller's place, talking about the three factors that define obstruction of housing. And so that's coming at noon. And right now, I just want to hand off the conference to our president, Kurt Johansson, to bring us our first panel. So thank you guys very much for your participation. We'll see you at the next event.
I would like to welcome up our three panelists this morning for our first discussion. I want to just say a few words about the three. First of all, Alan Greenlee is the Executive Director of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. That's a mouthful, but I can't even do the acronym on that one. He has designed, implemented, and managed programs operating from coast to coast, impacting hundreds of thousands of low-income and underserved families. Our second speaker is Tanua Thrash Intuk, and Tanua is Executive Director of the Los Angeles Local Initiative Support Corporation, and prior to joining LISC, Tanua served as Executive Director of West Angeles Community Development Corporation, where she was responsible for the asset management and oversight of the real estate portfolio valued at $150 million. And finally, we have Brent Gaisford, who's the board chair for Abundant Housing LA. And Brent is also the CFO and co-founder of Treehouse Co-Living, which builds and manages community-focused apartment buildings. So we've got three folks who have a lot of on-the-ground experience. And I just want to set this panel up by letting everybody know that, of course, in the afternoon we have more panels where we're going to get into more of the detail on potential solutions. Our goal is to sort of talk a little bit more at the 30,000-foot level about the problem. And of course, I think there's a couple of things we can agree upon just starting out. The first one is we have a serious housing problem in California. And I can't find anybody who doesn't agree with that statement anymore. The debate is always how to solve it and what we need to do. But some of the bad news, of course, is that we have a shortfall of 3.5 million affordable housing units. So that number just keeps increasing. Serious problem. If we use the 30% of gross wage metric, people need to be earning in the $45 an hour range to be able to afford housing, which of course so much of the California working population cannot. We're averaging 80,000 new homes a year over the past 10 years. We need 180,000. That's how short we are on building houses. And, we've got 3 million people paying greater than 30% of their gross income for apartments, and we have 1.7 million paying 50% of their gross income for rent. And home ownership is at its lowest rate since the 1940s. So we've got a lot of problems. The question is how to solve them. And I think we're going to hear a lot from our panelists today about their experiences, what works, what doesn't work, the obstacles we all have to overcome. And then, of course, we'll follow it up with Senator Wiener talking about his trials and tribulations with SB 50. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you again, members who've joined. And if anybody else, we have a very affordable membership for Council of Infill Builders. But the one thing I want to say, just to sort of echo what Mott was talking about, I co-founded this organization, and I really like the Council of Infill Builders because we've stayed true to our mission for 11 years. We're at the table on legislation in Sacramento on all important issues, and we don't compromise from our original mission. And our board members, I love our board members. They're hands-on people. They educate around the state, and we've had a lot of successes with getting cities to become more proactive about dealing with this problem that we have so that we don't necessarily have to be fighting at the state level. But anyway, it's a wonderful organization. Thank you again, those who've joined, and we'd love to see more of you. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention was sort of on a tangent a little bit, but I was struck last week when I heard about what's happened in Minneapolis. I don't know if any of you follow what's going on over there, but Minneapolis seems to be the first city in the United States who has taken the bold step of saying no more single-family development within their city limits. And it's in their comprehensive plan. And, Minneapolis is a fairly progressive city, not more progressive than our coastal California cities, but certainly probably the most progressive city in the Midwest. But they've just basically said, we have to be accountable and we have to step up. And lots of debate, lots of people scared to death what that really means. But in the end, I think it was unanimous, or it was 11-1 or something. It was a mandate for cities taking responsibility for housing because they have the same problem. People are getting priced out, and people need to be able to live near where they work and play and recreate. So thanks again for everybody being here, and we'll just get kicked off today with Alan, who's going to start us off on the panel.
Terrific. Good morning, everybody. How are you all doing today?
Morning.
All right. Thanks for that warm round of indifference. I'm Alan Greenlee. Really, really happy to be here. I took a look at the agenda for the remainder of the day, and you got some really fancy people coming to speak, and expect that the dialogue will be provocative and interesting. I spend a good amount of time chatting with Mott, and we've over the years have developed what I think is a strong affinity and respect for each other. I think the building that you guys do is really important. I want to make sure that I leave you with the impression that we are pro-development. I wonder, is there anybody in this room who who develops 100% affordable housing? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, great. So I will. There's a couple of things I want to say about that, and I'm not going to take a bunch of time to start us off. I just want to sort of touch on 5 things very briefly, and my understanding is the session question is a progressive coalition on infill housing possible in Southern California? And I think it is, and that concludes my remarks. I absolutely think it is. I mean, I think we've gotten to the place now where the notion of affordability has kind of struck the typical Angelino or Southern Californian in a way that resonates in a way that has never happened before in my 30 some odd years of doing affordable housing advocacy. I was sitting in a stoplight on my bike recently in Koreatown, and a car pulled up next to me, and the passenger window was down, and I heard the passenger say, just as the light turned green, that Los Angeles is the most expensive place in the country to live, and the car drove off, and I was like, wait, you're my people, come back. So literally the man on the street understands that this is an expensive place to live. I think where this is one of those situations where as you dig into the details, these things get a little bit more complicated. My job every day is to ensure that development happens for folks at the lower income spectrum. And I'm happy to say a couple of really what I think are interesting things. So we passed at the ballot measures HHH and H in 2016 to develop supportive housing for people who are chronically homeless. And the question was, could affordable housing developers mobilize fast enough to realize the possibility of that money? And actually, could the public sector do that too? And I think there's a challenge there for the public sector to be able to sort of grow. And for a year, you could hear our system creaking. And that creaking was folks hiring, trying to ramp up, trying to identify sites, trying to build the capital stack. And I'm happy to report that in just a 1-year period, year-over-year period, the city and many of my members tripled their capacity to develop supportive housing, which is great news, right? It's a good thing. It's possible to ramp up. I think the bad news is that while the resources that are available were targeted to chronic homeless people, which is really important, we're falling behind with respect to the numbers of folks who are homeless. And what we're finding is that people who are not special needs, people who are working for a living, people who are raising families and paying their taxes, are falling into homelessness faster than we can house folks. And I think that there's an opportunity for all of us to participate in that. And that's where this notion of a progressive coalition comes to bear. And so I'm just going to leave you with sort of my 5 thoughts, which I promised to weave in during the course of the discussion. But one I've sort of alluded to, which is if we're talking about increasing production, I think it's really important to have a really honest conversation about who we're going to try to build for. The second thing is, what's the tension or opportunity associated with this notion of free market versus market intervention? I think that's an area for our members, for example, are under no delusions that they're operating in a free market. They're operating in an absolutely controlled marketplace, and I would propose that all of us are. The question is, what's the right amount? The third thing I want to say is, who really is our opposition? Like, I think that affordable housing developers and folks in this room have more in common than in opposition. It's just that the public policy levers have put us at times at odds, and I think that's something that we need to work through. I want to talk a little bit about recent successful Southern California coalitions. So I'll make sure to weave that in about places where we've won in the legislative context or won at the ballot. And then the last thing I want to sort of talk about is can we have it all? Can we build at all levels? Can people who do residential real estate development for a living, who want to make money, can they make money and also provide housing that's affordable for low-income folks? And so I'm going to stop there and just again express my appreciation to the Infill Builders and to Kurt for walking me through how this conversation was going to go. That was very helpful, and look forward to hearing what Tanu and Brent have to say, and then really, really look forward to the dialogue, the conversation between all of us.
Well, thank you, Alan. I had a couple of thoughts quickly. One of the things I didn't mention in my opening was that I noticed that while California has 12% of the homeless, of the nation's population, we have 22% of the homeless population. And I just wonder how much of that 22% is actually people who have fallen into that category where they're not really homeless, but they are homeless. I mean, that's kind of a scary, and you're telling us that that trend is continuing.
It's growing, yeah.
It's growing, yeah. Wow. And I also noticed that the latest number I saw, the median published in my part of California, which is the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, our median is past $850. And that's a median home price that includes 100-year-old tear-down houses all over the place. So when a median gets that high, it's just staggering to imagine where people are driving from to get to work. And we have the same traffic problem up there that you all have down here. So when you mention increasing production and who we're going to build for, Alan, is it your thought that there is a balance to be found between affordability and market rate, or do we need to really be putting so much energy into affordability because the market rate kind of takes care of itself better?
Well, yeah, I went back just to make sure I had my facts right, and I went and looked at the RENA reports for LA City and LA County, and so the sad fact of the matter is, unless you're Tom Brady and Giselle, we're not building anything for you, right? So basically at all income levels, except for sort of the luxury level, we're at a deficit about our production versus the goal. So, I kind of feel like at this point right now, almost no intervention is wrong. There's a place at every segment of the household income spectrum that we need to build for people. But what I will say is that without market intervention, we're way better at building housing that's market rate and actually cash flows. And so what that requires is a little bit of engineering with respect to how you encourage folks to do that. And I would just say that an opportunity that I see is that we are, and I'm guilty of it too, that we are kind of, we stake out our place and then we become relatively intractable with respect to negotiation and trying to get ourselves to yes. And so there are a number of public policy matters where I would propose that an infill builder member and a SCAMP member would agree, but in many respects our initial reaction is to want to fight about it. And so we need to explore that space a little bit more. I think the great news is, at the state level, they understand that. In Sacramento, we had 250 housing bills introduced, 30 of them on the very first day of the legislature. What's really kind of tragic is almost none of them are going to pass. And that was 250 as opposed to about 130 the year before, which was exponentially larger than any other year before. So the good news is democracy works. Elected officials listen. They behave as their constituents encourage them to do. The problem is, as Senator Weiner will explain to you, as he's now in what will be the fourth year of him trying to do an upzoning bill, these things take a while. And, you know, I'll stop there.
Good point. Actually, and I'm glad Senator Wiener is going to be here to talk about this today. He's obviously run into a firestorm because local land use is sort of a sacred cow in California, as we all know. But what I like about what Senator Wiener's bill has done, which I like about a lot of stuff that happens in Sacramento, is it's a wake-up call. And that's the reason I mentioned Minneapolis, is they got ahead of the curve so that, you know, cities really want to control their land use. They need to be proactive about solving problems. And so the more we get this dialogue going at that level, so the state can actually not feel obligated to be constantly introducing hundreds and hundreds of housing bills all the time, would be a wonderful outcome. And so it'd be interesting to, I mean, I think of SB 50 as a change agent. I mean, that's really what it is. It's getting people to actually do what we're doing here today. Let's talk about ideas about how to solve the problem in the very best way possible. So thank you. There'll be, and one little change, we're going to have Q&A at the end, of course, so all of you will have a good opportunity to ask the panelists anything you want. But we're going to look to 11:15 to try to get this all wrapped up so we can give a little bit more time to Senator Wiener to speak this morning. So just keep that in mind. If we can make that work, we will. So our next speaker now is Tanua Thrash Intuk, and you've heard her bio. You've read about her. She's been involved in an awful lot of things and has a lot of experience. So we're looking forward to hearing from her. Tanua?
Great, thank you. Sorry, as I was driving in on my 2 hours over this way, I didn't talk to anybody in the car, so I'm trying to get myself together. I was listening to what was happening in national politics. So it should clear up shortly. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I don't get over on the west side like I used to, so it's great to be back here and to be among several friends in the audience. So when I think about and I begin to consider sort of where we are with the affordable housing crisis or the housing crisis, I have now subscribed to this concept that there are sort of two distinct areas that we could and should be working on as an industry, but just all of us in coalition. One, and Alan really laid it out, and that is, frankly, no matter how we slice it, the bottom 20%, 25% of our population simply cannot afford, with one job, with two jobs, to be able to live in society in any comfortable way. And so what that means, you've heard about the statistics around rent burdenness. So people simply, given where our wages are, given where people are in terms of their income and wealth, just don't have the resources to be able to sustain themselves in any what we would consider to be habitable circumstances. And because of that, that is part of what is fueling what we see as the human tragedy on our streets all over, not just Los Angeles, but our county and really the nation, and drives the interest in trying to figure out what can we do with that population. So that's one of the areas. The second is really all about the way cities have gone about doing their business of determining, who can live here, under what circumstances are they going to live here, and how are we going to design this place. I went into urban planning because as a young woman, I had the opportunity to visit apartheid South Africa. And if any of you have ever been to South Africa, it is the most extreme urban planning concept of how do you create places to physically hold people under circumstances that are as extreme can get, just short of being some sort of level of concentration camps. And I went into urban planning because I believe that there was an opportunity to create much more integrated places and societies. Unfortunately, the way cities have gone about their business, we have not been able to achieve that. And it's necessary then to create the kind of supply, as we've already heard, at all various levels. And this is important to say as an affordable housing developer and financier, because too often in too many conversations, what we're hearing is that it's a zero-sum game. Tanua, if you talk about in any way housing anybody else other than the homeless, you have no compassion. You're not getting to the issues. But the truth is we have to have housing at all levels right now, and we don't have that. So talking a little bit about some of the solutions that we're working on at LISC. When it comes to the bottom 20%, we're doing our part to try and finance and build the capacity of the affordable housing industry as quickly as we can to get those levers moving with the HHH resources, where I sit on that Citizens Oversight Commission as the vice chair, the state dollars. So our goal is to move those out as quickly as we can. But we also know that from a macro perspective, while we're doing that, frankly, one of the areas where we need to have coalitions is around thinking about how do we help people in the bottom 20% live on one job. So that means we've got to think about wages, we've got to think about the future of work, because people who have a certain skill set, experience in education, are folks who can, there's only so many hours in the day, and how can we make sure that they either have access to some level of entitlement around housing, or how do we make sure they have at least the basics so that they can afford housing. So our goal right now in that area is to move as quickly as we can. When it comes to housing supply, one of the things that LISC is doing, and I'm really glad to see my friend Helen Lung from LA Moss here, is really trying to work within the confines of, if single family homes is where people are right now, how can we then add to our current infrastructure by adding accessory dwelling units in those places? How can we really think about increasing the supply within a footwork or at least framework that people are comfortable with at this time, because of the dire need to have additional supply. And so that's an area that we're working in and really trying to push forward and encourage people to look at. So from a coalition perspective, what kinds of coalitions need to take place in order for urban infill to happen? We've got to get outside of just housing coalitions. We've got to get into transportation coalitions. We have to get into environmental coalitions as a housing community. One of the things that we forget to, or at least I know for me, sometimes I forget to consider, is that building housing and infill, and all of you know this here, has a more positive impact on our environment, right? Because now we're building possibly near transit, near jobs, there's less travel, and now there's an ability to really try and concentrate both jobs and transportation, and that has an impact on our environment. The environmental community has all kinds of celebrities who are involved in that movement. We don't have such folks in the housing space. And I think that part of that is we've got to get connected with some of those other industries and coalitions and connect the concept of, in order to improve the environment, we have to build more housing, we have to build it more closely together, more densely, and near transportation. And then finally, and we can talk a little bit more about this as we get into the discussion, one of the reasons we kind of touched on home ownership. And one of the reasons I think people are so caught up in ensuring that they can maintain their single family home, and for good reason, is because of wealth creation. We know that home ownership, as a #1 generator for most Americans, as their largest asset and as a huge source of wealth generation. As long as that is the case, people will continue to cling to their single family homes and the way that they know how to, and the way that our tax structure and infrastructure allows people to be able to build wealth through that single family home. So yes, it is the mortgage interest deduction, and yes, it is the automatic sort of savings that you're doing on a regular basis by paying into your mortgage monthly. And to the extent that we begin to think about what are other mechanisms by which people can build wealth in this country, that is going to be an area of, it'll be hard to sort of get that out of people's hands and wrestle that out of their minds, that there is another way to be able to build wealth and to have vibrant communities that we want to have. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Stimulating ideas, Tanua. I was just, as you were speaking, I was thinking, okay, now what celebrities can we go after for housing? Hey, it's like, that would be challenging.
It shouldn't be, though.
It shouldn't be, but, that's interesting because the environmental community has done a pretty good job of that. You mentioned the bottom 20% of Californians, Tanua, and I guess because we do have a number of affordable housing developers in the audience today, which is wonderful. Do you think that this problem is a city problem to solve, or is it a regional problem to solve, or should the state? I'm just wondering about how you feel about whether the state needs to continue to push regional and city governments to do more.
Yes. So a couple of things. One, we know as a state that we're losing out on key jobs and key employers because they simply cannot find the talent who can remain here and be able to purchase homes. And that's of course at all levels. When it comes to the bottom 20%, it's a whole host of things and requires its own conference in of itself, because it is, on one hand, I talked about it already, it is about wages. We should be talking about what are the roles of employers who employ people at these wages. Not only is it that, we have to decide as a nation, is housing an entitlement? Should people who are at the bottom 20% automatically be able to access the resources that are necessary in order to be able to live in this country, in this region? So it's the role for, I think, our state is the other thing to think about, and this speaks to Wiener's bill, is that the state's role really is land management and trying to figure out what should happen with the land. But at this point, cities have decided it's theirs, but really the state has provided that to cities. And so it's totally appropriate for the state to try and figure out what else can be happening with land in such a way that we resolve for these issues.
Good point. One more question from me, and then we'll move on. I was curious. We haven't touched on CEQA much. I'm sort of a crusader for what started about 12 years ago for me to argue for CEQA to be split into two. This 40-plus-year-old bill seems to be used frivolously against housing all over the state of California, and I've been a victim of it numerous times, and I'm trying to build some of the most sustainable housing in the state, and yet the way CEQA is set up, even with the reforms that have happened over decades, it really hasn't incentivized sustainable housing. And by sustainable, I mean the kinds of housing that not only deals with the socioeconomic issues we're talking about, but the environmental issues as well. I have a number of developer friends who would love to do more sustainable stuff. They would love to build the kind of housing we need. But the problem is CEQA has to get factored in everything anybody tries to do, because it doesn't discriminate. It just sets it up for an easy target for all development. Do you support at all the idea that reform for CEQA would be a help to get more affordable housing built?
Why did you ask that? Why did you leave
I
that
don't know.
question for me?
Why did I ask you that? I don't know. Everybody's going to get a shot. Don't worry.
So just to shorten it, I am a proponent of, we have got to begin to think about CEQA in the form of not how green is my building, but how green is this region and what the environmental impact is to this entire space. And when we start to move towards that, then I think we can have, it could be a more effective tool. And then the other element is, I'm sure someone has done some analysis on this. I have not seen it. And the question is, on how many occasions or what percentage of time has CEQA been used in a challenged in a way that it's actually an environmental matter and not other matters. Not that those other matters are not imperative, but then that speaks to what are the mechanisms to ensure that those other matters get addressed in our development process.
Good. Nice stimulating thought there. Okay, thank you so much, Dino. And now let's hear from Brent.
Great. Thanks, Kurt. All right, so I'll kick this off with a little who am I? And what am I doing up here? So I'm a reformed management consultant. And I moved to LA 11 years ago. And about 6 years ago, I started to think maybe California and LA, I wanted this to be my forever home. But I didn't want to have to try to get rich. I wanted to keep that off my life to-do list. Now, if it happens, I'm not going to be upset. But that's not what I want to make my life choices around. But at the same time, I want to have a family. And as I started to think about that more, it seemed pretty clear to me that wasn't, you can't have both of those things if you want to live in Los Angeles. And that just seemed strange to me. Something seemed off. I knew that I was in a really privileged place, actually, compared to most people living in the region. So if I was having trouble, what was happening to everyone else? And as soon as I started to pull on that thread a little bit, I realized I had to try to do something. So helped start this organization called Abundant Housing, which is a nonprofit that advocates for more affordable housing, more market rate housing, more of all of it. We need everything. At the end of the day, there's more people who live here and want to live here and have jobs here than we've got places to live. And so that sort of, everything else follows from that. And so that's our mission and what we do. So to the matter at hand, I think housing is actually already a really interesting cross-party issue. That's part of actually what attracted me to it, is there's no defined, when you talk about, abortion or, how people feel about taxes in general, we've already got these huge, the parties have sort of staked out their claim and taught everyone within the party that they should feel one way. And so it's very hard to have a discussion about those things that doesn't immediately flare up this response within people. And so it's really hard to have a discussion about that. Housing is entirely the opposite. It's not, there are no party lines, and you can see it in some really interesting ways. There are plans put out by very progressive groups and very conservative groups about housing that are the same. Now, that's not to say that all of those, there can still be bad ideas. But I really think this is an area where the vast majority of people are good faith actors who are trying to figure out solutions. And I think that's a really sort of unfortunately a unique thing in American politics these days, and gives us a real opportunity to achieve a progressive consensus, and I would even hope, a general consensus around housing solutions in this state. And I think we're on that path. That said, the caveat to that is because of our current political environment, I think most people, and myself included, I'm guilty of this as well, are disinclined to trust people's intentions. When a plan is proposed by someone, the first thing people usually think about is who is proposing it. That's what we go to see if it's a good plan or not. And I would go ahead and throw out there that we should stop doing that. Let's think seriously about the issues and the right solutions, and trust that most people are working in good faith, with maybe a few rare exceptions that are my personal opinions. And I won't get into. And so the other thing that I think is really, really encouraging about housing is that this is an issue that it gets into everything. You can solve so many problems with this one big swing. So first of all, there's just the obvious social equity situation. Right now we've got a system where increasingly more and more of the wealth in our society is transferred from people who rent to people who own already existing buildings. So that's going from the poor to the rich. That's the opposite direction of what we generally want to achieve. And so that's, and it gets much more insidious than that though, because of course, social science says the best way to make more money is to live in a more affluent place, live near where there are good jobs. It's very hard to get a good job if you don't have anywhere near you. But housing policy, of course, makes that systematically impossible. You know, here we're all complaining about trying to get to the west side, which maybe means we're all not rich enough to live on the west side. But anyway, but this is where all the jobs are. This is where all the highest paying jobs are in our region, and only the ultra wealthy can afford to live here. And that, you know, that's a huge problem that plays itself out, you know, regionally, even at the fairly local level. So anyway, that's a big piece of it as well. Environmental issues as well. You know, I see a number of you know, full-time environmentalists in the audience today, and you know, that's because I think housing can solve those issues as well. People who live in rural areas or far-flung suburban areas have 10x the carbon impact of people who live near where they work in dense city centers. And so by actually building infill, you know, we can make huge strides environmentally that are almost impossible to achieve any other way. This notion that sometimes I see expressed that, hey, well, if we just don't build this building, that'll be good for the environment, it's sort of baked into that is this idea that, like, by building buildings we create people, but that's obviously not right. And so we've got to figure out, there's so many of us, how do we get people to where they need to be so we stop driving everywhere? And then of course that layers in with traffic. If you hate driving for 2 hours to get here, maybe we should figure out ways to let us live closer to where we need to be, to build transit. And again, all these things are all so closely tied together. Density and the transit that both enables and creates is what gets us all of those things. And then the last one that I would throw out there is livability. Most people take vacations to places where you can walk around and you go shopping and you go to restaurants, and we love to go to quaint European towns and the old cities of America where you can, you know, stay in a hotel and walk to restaurants. And so I think it's pretty clear that we enjoy that. There's serious livability benefits to being able to live a life where you're not constantly just transiting from place to place. It's not fun. You like to do things. And so I think there's a big just livability component to all of this as well. And a really easy way to get people on board is, you know, hey, do you want to be able to walk to a grocery store? Do you want to be able to walk to, you know, a corner bakery or a flower shop? Those are things that everyone wants in their neighborhoods, and the way we get those things is, again, with more housing and density. So anyway, all that to say, this already is a huge big tent issue because there are so many people who have a vested interest in this problem getting solved. I didn't even mention schools. Schools is another giant one, but I won't go through the list on that. Giant school equity problems with choice being based on where you live. So in any case, it is by its nature a big tent issue, and you can start to see that coming together, and I think we just need to do a better job of connecting all those pieces and finding the specific pieces of legislation that you know, people from all of those groups, or at least a coalition of those groups, depending on the issue, feel like, hey, we're all pulling and getting something that's near and dear to us with this legislative action. There's a huge number of those sorts of choices out there available to us. And so that gives me great hope for the future. And on that note, though, most people are actually already there. The LA Times did a really interesting survey where they asked people, hey, should we have more housing near jobs and transit? And 60% of Californians just already said yes. And so I think there's sort of a fundamental disconnect happening because legislators only get to hear from us rarely. In their election, when it's not maybe clear exactly why you got elected, you just know you did and you're really happy about it. And then our ballot initiatives, but those aren't necessarily the clearest signals as well, although I do wish our electeds would maybe look at those signals a little harder. But in any case, there already is this clear consensus, but in general, the way we treat this problem is, hey, well, let's listen to the people who show up. All right, well, we're going to have a meeting about building one tall building in Westwood. As I was driving in, I saw a bunch of signs opposed to a tall building on Hillgard, which is full of tall buildings. But the way we make that decision is we have a meeting in this neighborhood with people who have ample free time to show up, often in the daytime even, or in the evenings. That's obviously not a representative sample of America. People who are working a lot, people who have kids, people who just don't have the time to go to lots of neighborhood meetings. But we pretend that it is. And so we pretend that we're doing the democratic thing by paying attention to those people who can show up to those meetings. I'm not saying those people's opinions don't matter, but we shouldn't try to pretend that that's representative. And I think that's a big thing that we can all work on. The counterpoint of that is, of course, it's very hard to remind yourself that there are other people you're not hearing from, and so we gotta all show up, really seriously. It could not be more important. And showing, it feels really frustrating when you show up and it takes 3 hours to talk about the one building, but when that starts to happen every time, it doesn't have to be you every time, but if you go to 1 out of every, 5, then the elected officials and the decision makers start to notice, oh, there's a lot of people actually on the other side of this. And that's how we start to have them see what the statistics already tell us is true. Yeah, and on that note though, this is a regional issue and there's big variance within how people feel about this depending on where they live. And broadly speaking right now, suburban areas, places that are currently full of single family homes, the consensus is not there in those places. But it has impacts on all of us. Of course, this is a regional problem, but we don't have solid regional governments, so I think it sort of ends up being kind of a state problem. But in any case, people who live in those suburban neighborhoods that killed SB 50 and 35 the year before that, people need to think about this a little more seriously. Children who grow up in those neighborhoods are going to have the same problems as children growing up in every neighborhood in California, which is you have to move out. There's literally no way to stay. And so trying to pretend that it doesn't impact you on your street because you own your home, that doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, if your street gets upzoned, just keep your house and you'll be great and you'll be fine. And you get to walk to the new corner store in any case. And then I think actually Oregon is really interesting, maybe even more so than Minneapolis, a really interesting illustrative example of this. The Times did a great piece on their recent huge housing bill. They had this giant big tent housing bill that went through their state legislature that did a number of things all at once. Had a bunch of renter protections in it. It put on a rent increase cap. I can't remember if it's vacancy decontrol or not, so don't quote me. It's 7% plus inflation. And then they got rid of the apartment ban across the state. No more single-family zoning. And there were a bunch of interesting things that happened to make that work. One was this sort of big tent. All these organizations and interest groups who have a reason to care about housing actually all came together and helped push it through. So I think we're close in California. All those groups all exist. We just have to get together. And then maybe even more interestingly for me was in the last session in Oregon, there was a pro-housing bill that was killed by one legislator. And then that legislator got crushed in their re-election campaign because everybody came together and they lost in a landslide. And then suddenly all the rest of the legislators in the state had a different opinion when things came up for a vote the following year. So I'll sort of leave that to everyone how we should think about that, but people respond to actions, and so we got to start taking some. Yeah, okay, and then the last thing I would want to talk about, our next biggest one, I think, in California is going to be the split roll in 2020. So split roll would end Prop 13 on commercial properties only, so not on residential. And I think it's it could not be more important because at the end of the day, there's no one law that makes it so hard to build housing, affordable housing, middle income housing in California. There's a huge number of them that we passed between, call it, 1978 and 2010. And each of those, small pieces individually just put up higher and higher barriers until so few things can come online, and the only things that can come online have to be able to pay all these fees. Anyway, we end up in the world we're in today. And we've got to start undoing those incentives one by one and putting better incentives in place that do make the world look the way we want it to look. And I personally believe Prop 13 is actually the biggest one of those, because it just creates an enormous disincentive to ever change. If you own a parking lot or a car wash, in a dense neighborhood, that your family's owned for 40 years, you're probably paying less than $10,000 a year of property tax. If you build a new building that can house a lot of people, you're going to be paying hugely more than that. And so it just creates this artificial system where change is hugely disincentivized. And so it's a big change. It'll be a big change for a lot of people in this room. I assume there's a lot of people who do own property, probably some of them commercial property. And yes, you would have to pay more tax. We're not going to sugarcoat that. But it's a one-time hit, and then the values readjust to what they should look like. And in return, we get a state that people can actually afford to live in, and we've not created this insane system that only benefits the people who happen to already own land. That's just the wrong way for the world to work. Feudalism is a lot further down the road, but that's the road that we're on. I can't imagine a world where most people can ever own property other than inheriting it, and that just seems so fundamentally wrong to me. So in any case, I think we're on a good path, and the coalition is there. We've just got to figure out how to work together more often and pick those right issues and trust each other. So anyway, that was probably too much, and I got a little dark there at the end, but thank you so much for bearing with me. And please check out the Split Roll and do some reading. I think it's incredibly interesting. And so important here that we'll all be voting on in 14 months.
Thank you so much. No problem with the feudalism. That was good. I have one question for the panel before I open it up to everybody in the audience for questions. And you touched upon it, Brent. You're using a model. I think one of the things that's really helpful for building consensus around these kinds of issues is for people to look at what others have done. I wear people out by telling them we should all just fly everybody over to Europe and take a look at some of the things that they've done over there, especially with transit and co-housing and things like that. But Oregon is an experiment that's been going on for quite some time. But I'm thinking California, and this is a question for all three of you. Where is a city or a region in California where you think they're out front on this, where they're doing some good work that people ought to pay attention to? Is there something that comes to mind where you think that there's actually they're further along on the curve? I'm just curious if anybody has, and anybody jump in there if you've got an idea of a region or a city that is doing some good things.
I mean, I would throw out there that it's not quite either of those things, but downtown LA to me is the most interesting part of Los Angeles right now. It's where I'm proud to live, and it's by far the most diverse place I've ever lived in every sense of the word. There's a huge number of low-income people there, many of them living in subsidized affordable housing, but many others just living in buildings that are cheap. There's a lot of diversity of that kind as well. Yeah. But at the same time, the population is of housed people and unhoused is exploding. It's gone from 8,000 people to 75,000 people in 20 years, and it's projected to go to 275,000 in the next 30, I think. And in that growth, what I see on the ground in my neighborhood is that because new buildings are built, the old buildings that are cheap don't get knocked down and they don't get converted to luxury buildings for rich people. I live, there are 3 SROs all around me, and none of them have been renovated in a hugely long time. There are some problems, and occasionally they need to get a stick to keep their buildings, livable. But on the flip side, those are buildings that are creating deeply affordable housing with no government subsidies because they've never been converted to housing for the rich, because that rich people live in the new buildings. And so I think downtown is a really, really interesting place, and I hope we can preserve that diversity as it changes for the future.
My orientation to this issue is that what I'm seeing in my role and just across LA County is, frankly, cities are overwhelmed and have no idea really how to respond to what is happening. And we have, for better or for worse, without redevelopment agencies, you don't have people within cities who are thinking about development in the way that we had previously. So frankly, I don't think that there's just one city. I think the city of LA is probably the furthest along. But one of the things that I've been thinking more and more about, and if anybody's interested, I would say, come talk to me, come join me, because I think this is something we should do. We are not having regional conversations right now with cities and saying to them and helping them understand, here are potential planning tools that can be used. Here's what other cities have done in the region. Here's what other cities have done across the country. Here are financing tools that can be used. Here's what's been done in the region. Here's what's done around the country. Here are public information campaigns that are happening because we have to change minds and hearts. And because that's not happening, cities here are tenant protection options that are available. Cities are just, trying to respond, and it's quite haphazard. I have a friend who is in the city of Inglewood, for example. Those of you who've been reading the paper know what's happening to the city of Inglewood and the Black population and gentrification, and some of you may be even developing in Inglewood. And when I called over to the city, because I said, gosh, what can we do? How can we help the city really think about how to create protections and opportunities for development to ensure that a whole lot of different kinds of people get to stay in Inglewood? And what I heard was that the city didn't have a good plan, didn't have a plan at all. And there was no leadership within the city trying to figure out exactly what should happen. And that led me to then begin to look at and realize that there are very few cities in the region, period, who have a comprehensive strategy that are looking at all of those elements that I just described and what's going to work for their city right now in the short term and in the long run. So join me if we want to try and at least get something together to begin to help cities look at what are some potential options for them to put in place, again, for the short term and long term.
So I have a only very slightly optimistic thing to say, and then a bunch of pessimistic things to say right after that. One is, at the state level, they did some stuff the last couple of years ago that really attempted to create increased incentive to meet housing element and then the resulting regional allocations for housing development. And I think that was really positive, this notion of the state sort of intervening in a way, Senator Wiener says, protecting local electeds from their constituents in order to make hard choices. I think that was a really great step, this idea of putting teeth into the housing element. And then I assume that you guys have some sense that the Southern California Association of Governments staff came in and said we need as they're going through their new housing element arena process. And so we need about 700,000 homes over the next 9 years, which first of all is not in my opinion, not aggressive enough number. And then the board promptly cut that by 60%. And so we have a structural issue within sort of our decision-making systems that has a bias against growth. And that's a problem. The other issue I think is a problem is this notion of local public agency capacity. I have the opportunity to spend a lot of time in the 5 Southern California counties. And I was speaking with an official in one of the eastern counties of our region, a housing agency head. And I said, as a result of the election in 2018, you're going to get an allocation of dollars that you can use to spend on affordable housing. No idea that was happening. I said, oh, by the way, it's going to be $17 million a year. It's not a ton of money, but it's money you could use. And the state will pay for you to build a plan over the next year. No idea. And so, there's a crisis of capacity in some respects. And I think that's an issue.
Well, so we have a lot of work to do. I'm anxious to hear from the audience. Please, anybody who has a question, just raise your hand and I'll call you to address anybody on the panel you'd like with comments. Don't feel you need to ask them anything. If you just want to state an opinion, that would be good. We'll start right here.
So,
and give us your name, please.
Sorry, my name is Will Sykes. I'm with Carmel Partners. We're a market rate developer. As somebody who based on fiscal issues. So I was just talking to Carl, who had to step out, but about a project in Costa Mesa where the city basically denied housing because they didn't want to pay for a new fire station. And to the extent that building housing means that they're, you know, that the choice between housing and commercial becomes even starker for cities, you just have to think through how do you make sure they're not making decisions saying, well, I'd really rather have a shopping center because then I get revenue that increases over time. So totally support the idea, but just we should think through that potential unintended consequence. And as to a city that's doing at least some stuff right, I was introduced recently to this magical place in San Diego. For projects that comply with the plan, they've sort of taken the discretion out of it. So you have a ministerial decision in no sequa up to really big projects as long as they comply with the plan. And that's just absolutely huge. And they add on top of that, if you go in and get if you go in and meet with the planner, they give you a written response to a bunch of questions, and they have to follow that response. They're bound by that for a year. So if they submit and say, we're interpreting the code this way, that's how they interpret it. So those sort of two things, that certainty and the speed to get through it because they've taken the discretionary decision out of it, are really, really helpful.
I would just say that certainty issue, I mean, you guys know it better than I do, but to the extent that policy can create certainty, that's the golden ticket, right? Like, let's figure out a way so that you can walk in one time, understand what the rules of the game are, and then build your building and move on, right? It's got to be possible.
Anybody else have any?
I would just say I agree with you on the I certainly don't want to incentivize commercial against residential more than it already is, but I just see that one on balance as a tremendous net win and the first of many other perhaps similar steps that we should take in the future.
Yes, sir. Right here. Name. Name, please.
Name is Gerhard Meyer, I'm an architect.
Thank you.
It seems to me that there is consensus in the state that we need to do something about our housing crisis and that the state needs to change and that we need to just change how we build our cities. But I don't think we have a consensus or even an appreciation at all of how to do that. And I think that the overriding opinion is that what we are building in terms of density is not universally appreciated at all, if even a little bit. I think it's actually, in my opinion, from a global perspective, not very good density at all. So a hyper-sized suburban inflation rather than placemaking that Frank talked about on the pedestrian scale and the urban scale. And there are, I mean, most of the European cities, I'm obviously speaking with an accent, most of the European cities are undertaking phenomenal size redevelopment projects. I mean, of a scale that we can't even imagine here. And they are done with the appreciation of the population, not with the opposition of the population. And Asia is on board with that too. They have studied that and it's happening there too. Do we have any mechanisms to start to learn from what they are doing differently, how they are doing differently, so that we can bring that same dynamic to our places?
That's a good point. It makes me think of the fire station versus housing issue. That wouldn't happen in Europe. Nowhere I've ever been in Europe would they go, well, we can't do that because you won't build us a fire station. The fire station gets built. It's not an issue. But again, that's a more socialized system over there, and taxation has a lot to do with that, of course.
I don't think we should just write it off to that aspect. That's a dismissal of what they're doing. They're building profoundly different urban fabric, profoundly different one. They deliberately detached from the way we were building cities 30 years ago, and we never followed suit. And we are stuck with a low capacity urban fabric now, and they have a high capacity fabric that they haven't explored even to the middle of their capacity.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no doubt. The planning aspect of it, the design aspect of it's crucial. But there's also, we talked a little bit about Prop 13 here. Prop 13 is a unique disincentive, for sure. And you know, I understand there's lots of arguments for it, and there's a lot of people that believe Prop 13 has done a lot of good. But you know, we'll see how this plays out next year. Other questions?
I did want to say thank you for bringing that to our attention. I had a chance to present to AIA Los Angeles last week, and I specifically talked about the role of the designers in coalition with this conversation. We here in the U.S. have a pretty fixed and narrow perspective of what placemaking and possibilities are with our built environment. And some would say we'll have to go back to both incentivizing it, but also including it in our educational plan, such that people who are now prepared to build our next set of cities going forward are people who are trained by those who are influenced by the world of design and architecture.
Good point. Questions over here? Yes.
Hi, my name is Brian Hamlin with California UV. This question is for Alan. So I think you noted that we're not really building anything except luxury housing right now. But isn't that the policy of Los Angeles? Isn't that, in part due to the advocacy work of your organization? I'm not trying to divide here, but right, like you supported the linkage fee, you support higher levels of inclusionary zoning, which just moves the market at which point it's profitable to build. And so, under those two policies, like how do we build housing that's affordable to the middle class if we're requiring new consumers of housing to provide what, in my view, is a human right and that we should all provide for, which is that everyone deserves safe, secure, affordable housing?
Thanks, Brian. I would also say that we supported JJJ over vociferous opposition of many people. And it included a little ditty that looks a lot like SB 50, which you support, that does a bunch of things that make a lot of sense. And the proof is in the pudding. It's 23% affordable housing units embedded in that as a result of people who have applied and gotten entitlements for extremely low income people that my developers have a hard time building for. And so, the linkage fee, for example, is something that is, a mechanism of state law that requires that we have to establish a nexus between development that happen in order to raise funds. We're still behind with respect to dollars available to build housing for folks at either homeless levels or extremely low income levels that we were in before 2011 when the governor got rid of redevelopment agencies. And so there's still not public resources available to be able to do that. So this function of sort of having to create a nexus means that we have a limited pool of places that we can go to get dollars. So fixing the Prop 13 issue would be really helpful in that regard. And as I mentioned before, we've figured out a way to incentivize through JJJ and the Transit-Oriented Communities Program ways for developers to make money and provide a public benefit by way of housing folks at extremely low incomes at the same time.
Thank you, Alan.
Housing that has a general plan amendment and zone changes down significantly. Well, and then those people who study that stuff say that what happened was in anticipation of those bills passing, people went and got their entitlements and started building before that. And the other thing is that there are indications of a softening of a market. When I start getting calls from brokers saying that they have land available, that means that other people aren't acquiring. And I'm not sure that's necessarily associated directly.
Sorry,
with
I have to cut this
linkage fee.
off because we've got a lot of other people who have questions in the audience. Yes, please.
Frank Silva with California Forward. I wanted to ask Brent and Tanua their analysis of AB 101 that for the first time in anybody's memory actually puts resources into local capacity, 250 million, 125 to the regional organizations and 125 to communities. It also puts $500 million into something known as infill housing, infill infrastructure for housing. Has a definition for what a qualified infill project would be, which is far broader than the sort of SB 50, I think is a fairly narrow model, not that it isn't needed, but I'd like your analysis of that new legislation.
I'm a big believer in knowing what you don't know, and I don't know about that bill, and I apologize. What I will say is I like money for housing, but I would have to do more learning. But it sounds interesting.
Sounds like we'd be happy to have a briefing with California Forward on your perspective on it, and then we'll let you know.
Great. Yes, right here.
Thanks. Carter Rubin. My organization, the Natural Resources Defense Council, has been, I think, one of the more outspoken environmental groups on supporting infill housing. But even for my organization, CEQA reform is sort of a bright line where we're not willing to go, except, we supported SB 35 to streamline certain aspects of CEQA. So I'm wondering, given that that's where a lot of environmental groups are at, what do you see as like a winning coalition in Sacramento that could advance CEQA reform? It seems like that gets thrown out as this necessary thing to hurdle, but I'm not sure I see where the coalition emerges for that.
I think it's impossible without you. So we got to figure out the right way to do it. Honestly, there's got to be a way, right? Like I think you would. I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I think many environmentalists would agree that the way it gets used today isn't the way it was supposed to get used. So we got to figure out the right way to fix it. But yeah, if environmental groups don't, if not take the lead, at least be deeply involved there, it won't. I don't think it'll happen.
And if I may, Amanda heard this from me in 2008, and maybe it was way too early at that time. But the whole idea for me of breaking CEQA into two, and you can call it spaghetti, I don't care. I call it sustainable and unsustainable. The idea is to debate what that definition is, what qualifies, but then at least create that incentive for people to shift towards a different model of how they build and where they build and what they build. And I don't care if it takes 2-3 years to define it, but once you have the framework set, that there's something to work toward, I think you'll see a lot of the private sector development shift to do that. Because as we've mentioned Europe a couple of times here, in Europe there's incentive to do the right thing. And we create so much disincentive here. And NRDC is one of my favorite organizations and always has been. You guys do such wonderful work. If there was a way to get out front on, and I even talked to Sierra Club about this, and it scares people to think about CEQA reform. I'm the first one to say, as a developer, and I've said this many times publicly, I can't imagine what California would look like without CEQA. It would be awful. It would just flat out be one of the worst places to live in the country. So CEQA's done wonderful things. But just like everything else that does wonderful things, when it hangs around too long and things change, then you have to tweak it. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but you tweak it. And it's that tweaking that I've been looking for. And I'm hoping it would be great if your organization could put some energy into this and try to come up with some stuff. Brent, did you have a...
Can I add something?
Oh, David, please.
Thank you. So I just want to highlight for Carter that the Planning and Conservation League has convened an assembly of plaintiffs and defendants' attorneys as a start, and they're now broadening it out to a larger group of people working on precisely that, and that is an attempt to figure out how do we make CEQA work the way we want it to and get it out of areas where it's become an impediment. So PCL is working on that.
Oh, PCL and NRDC together, that would be good. Questions? We have time for a couple more. Who did I not see? Right here? Yes, sir?
My name's Andrew Malick. I'm an infill developer in San Diego, and forget everything you've heard that gentleman said. Don't need any more competitions. So, admittedly, I'm really proud of our city. I think we do have some progressive housing policy there. My question's on permanent supportive housing. This is something that I do believe that I'm an advocate for housing first. I think it's really important. But how do you answer the objection to housing first when dealt with at the state level? And what I mean by that is, we would have potentially an immigration problem if California were a state that provided sort of a housing first policy and housed all of those homeless. Doesn't it need to be a federal policy? Don't we need federal intervention to really treat this problem? Otherwise, we're going to have everybody from Iowa
I feel like you're looking at me.
I hope to.
Do you wanna?
I hope to. You want to go first?
No, you're
I
way
don't usually
smarter than
let
me.
you go first, but.
You go.
So absolutely, there is absolutely a role for the federal government in helping to shape the concept in this country about the role of housing and our responsibility as a nation to those who are unable to care for themselves and or those who are at a point where they are unable to earn and have the income to sustain. So yes, there's absolutely a role. But we've got to do something in the meantime because, we have entirely too many people on the street today, and we have too many people who we are not even counting who will be on the street tomorrow. And so there is an emergency circumstance. I just don't buy the concept that people from Iowa are going to be moving to California to come here to live. It is, to me, those people could be here now. I mean, you move to places where you have some connection. You move to places where you are interested in that lifestyle. But this concept that if we were, the only state in the nation, which I'm not even sure how we really even get there, because I don't know how we would finance that just yet. If we were, just housing everyone, not just who was on the street, but everyone who could and should be eligible for some level of housing because of their income, I do not buy that they will be here in Los Angeles. And keep in mind that New York houses everybody on the street. I don't see people running to New York necessarily to get access to a shelter there.
Yeah, the only thing I would say to add to that is that the statistics say that there's not an in-migration of homeless people. They're indigenous here, right? To be honest, I haven't really thought through sort of whether you create a gravity to bring people here. I think my first response would be, let's look at the numbers right now that suggest that maybe that's not true. And then the other one is, does a homeless guy in Iowa have the capacity to pick up his stuff and move? And I think that's hard. And so. Yeah.
One last question, then we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll hear from the senator. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Julian Van Meiden, municipal in-house attorney from Land Use Real Estate at CEQA, defending a number of lawsuits challenging infill development, and also involved in helping to draft zoning regulations that would allow for mixed-use infill. And was also previously general counsel for a redevelopment agency and watched what dissolution did to the amount of funding available for affordable housing. And so on the state level, what we've been trying to get some traction on is a couple of things. One, can we please look at this funding mechanism again and focus it on affordable housing? Because there are a lot of real property tax revenues available that could in some way, shape, or form be used for that purpose. It was very effective, and we have a lot of local housing authorities that have on-the-ground experience, know where the real estate is, know how to put together those funding packages that make affordable housing projects work on a local level, and that's really what it all boils down to, is we've got to fill them in, and that is on a local level. The other piece I want to make folks aware of is that at the end of the era of redevelopment, a lot of agencies floated bonds. There was almost $500 million worth of bonds floating. They called it the Mardi Gras, and those were frozen. A lot of those bond funds were for purposes of affordable housing. And so far, the reaction we have gotten from the State Department of Finance has basically been pound sand. That money's going to get defeased. It's already been bought. The money is sitting there. The state needs to free it up and allow local agencies to use that money, but then draft some legislation, and we have proposed legislation that would target that money to the extent it can be used under the bond covenants for affordable housing. It's right there. It could be used like that with a stroke of a pen. So I just wanted to make folks aware that while the state appears to be all excited and everyone is proposing legislation, scads of bills, there is money, local money sitting there that could be put to use almost immediately. So anyway, call your legislators and make a statement about that, because the two things. Loosen up the money, and two, let's take another look at not redevelopment 2.0, maybe it's affordable housing 1.0.
Panel, last thoughts?
Can I just say three things
Please.
to that? One is money is the linchpin for rent covenanted affordable housing. Somebody's got to pay. You got to do it. I'm not sure. First of all, it's not okay for the executive director of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit to say this, but it is also true that my guys can't build their way out of this affordability problem. So we need to do a bunch of different things. Second thing is that defeasing thing, that fancy word you just used, is happening in Glendale. $20 million of. So there's a bill
Yes, I know.
making its way. We're going to do it. Thank you very much for doing that. And I can't remember what the third thing was.
Tanua, any last thoughts?
I'm really excited that the environmental folks are here, because I think that is a key part of the public hearts and mind turn. I think that many of the people who are fighting against getting rid of single-family homes or densifying, folks who are fighting against dense projects in key neighborhoods would probably also raise their hands and say that they're environmentalists. And I'm interested in having that coalition so that we can help to create the bridge for people to understand that if you call yourself an environmentalist, you also have to be committed to housing in a different way and creating the kinds of communities that are the future cities that we want to have and need in order to sustain ourselves.
Thank you. Brent?
I'll throw out one last thought. Maybe hope it won't make anybody too mad. Infill builders, I hope, means people who build new buildings. There's a lot of people I meet in the real estate world whose job is buying old stuff and kicking out the poor people who live there and renovating it and reopening it. And that doesn't help this problem at all. It's literally just displacement. And we've got a system where that is what's incentivized. It's almost impossible to build something new, and it's people follow the money. That's what most people are trying to do with their lives, is figure out how to make some money. You can have opinions on that, but it's mostly the way the world works right now. And so we got to figure out how to change that dial and to stop incentivizing people from just pushing out the poor and to start building new housing that houses more people, because we got to have room for more people in LA.
I want to thank the panel and thank the audience. It has been a really good session. We will take a very quick 4 or 5 minute break for those of you who need a break, and then we'll hear from the senator.
Way to go, Tanua. Way to go, Brent. Morning, kids. Way to go, man. How are you?
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to make the panel interesting. You did it, man. All right.
Oh.
This one on. Could have everybody get their seats, please. We're going to continue. Thank you so much. Everybody could take their seats. Yep, we're okay. If everybody could take their seats, we'll get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote today, Scott Wiener, who represents San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate. Elected in 2016, Senator Wiener focuses extensively on housing, transportation, civil rights, criminal justice reform, clean energy, and alleviating poverty. He chairs the Senate Housing Committee. Before being elected to the Senate, Senator Wiener served as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. He practiced law for 15 years, including nearly a decade as a deputy city attorney in the San Francisco City Attorney's Office. He's also served in a number of community leadership roles, including co-chair of the San Francisco LGBT Community Center and on the National Board of Directors of the Human Rights Campaign. Senator Wiener has lived in San Francisco's Castro neighborhood since 1997, and he received degrees from Duke and Harvard. Please welcome our keynote, Senator Wiener.
Good morning still. Morning. And thank you for having me here today, and thank you for doing this this symposium. I think in so many ways, we're having all these fights about housing in Sacramento, in LA, and really in the Bay Area, everywhere. It's a lot of fighting going on these days and disagreeing, and it's difficult, but this is incredibly healthy because we're finally starting to grapple with an issue that this state has frankly ignored for decades and decades. We have in California what I call a housing last policy. Housing is sort of the bottom of the barrel. When we have these debates about housing, traditionally in California, it's like, okay, well, first we have to make sure that people can park. We have to make sure that there's not extra traffic. We have to make sure that people's views aren't blocked. We have to make sure that there aren't shadows on anywhere. In San Francisco, there's an obsession with you can't shadow anything. I'm sure you have that here too. We have to make sure that we don't have extra kids in my kid's public school class. It's like everything other than housing. And what got lost in the shuffle is that housing is pretty foundational to human life. In fact, other than like water, food, air, and childbirth, I can't think of anything else that's more foundational than people having a safe and appropriate place to live. And that seems really, everyone laughs a little bit, it's pretty logical and common sense, but that really got lost. And, as most vividly shown by this notion that the pro-environment thing to do is to oppose all development, that's somehow a pro-environment stance. And so we lost our way on housing. And, when we have these debates, I find that it's so important to bring it back to the human level, because when we debate housing, we tend to get caught up in very technical, jargony terms. We talk about zoning and CEQA and RENA and housing elements and prevailing wage and so on and so forth, impact fees, all these words that your average person who's not an insider may have no idea what you're talking about, or may have a vague idea what zoning or CEQA means, but probably doesn't know much. But so when we have it in those terms, we limit ourselves. It's housing people and elected officials and neighborhood groups and sort of the insiders debate it. But when we bring it down to the human scale, people understand it. Because people may not know what zoning or CEQA means, but they do know that their kid came home from school one day and said that they have a homeless kid in their class, because 1 in 20 school children at a minimum in California is homeless. Or they know that they have a former neighbor, as someone told me the other day, multiple neighbors, who are now living in their cars in the same neighborhood, but they're now living in a car or a van instead of a home. People know that. They can see that from their lives. People know that there was a young family down the street that had a second or third kid and now lives in Denver because there is no housing that they could possibly afford for a growing family. Or they know that their kid just graduated college and can't move back to the community where they grew up unless they're going to live in their parents' basement, because there is no housing they can afford. We've basically put up a sign saying, you're not welcome here. If you can't afford, say, a single family home in our community, you're not welcome in our community. So people may not know the technical stuff, but they know what the impacts are. And we see that in the polling, and we know that despite all of the intense controversy that we have in City Hall and in the state legislature, this intense controversy, and the people who even make arguments like, supply and demand doesn't apply to housing, it's not a supply issue, and other sort of specious arguments that we hear, the actual people, like the broad population, they get that. And these aren't the people who show up at town halls and yell at their state legislators, or show up at City Hall and spend 6 hours at a planning commission hearing. No offense to those people. I know there's some in the room today. That's an important role. But the vast majority of people don't even know that those hearings are happening. These are the people who, the single mom who is trying to raise 2 kids and works 3 jobs. She's not showing up at planning commission hearings or emailing her state senator or going to a town hall. She's just trying to survive, and she needs housing. And so, when I had members of colleagues in the legislature, mostly in the Southern California area, who will make statements to me like, everyone in my district hates SB 50. And I would say to them that's false. You're definitely wrong, and not there are people who have opinions who don't email you or show up at town halls or go to neighborhood meetings. But fortunately, in the last few months, 3 different polls have come out on SB 50, but it's not just SB 50. This could be translated to any pro-housing policy. But 3 polls on SB 50 with brutally honest questions about allowing apartment buildings in single-family home neighborhoods, overriding local density and height and zoning restrictions, showing support statewide between 61% and 66%. in these three polls, three very consistent polls. Support in every region of the state, every single region. Higher support among renters, but majority support among homeowners even. Higher support among young people, but majority support among people 50 and older as well, the demographic that I'll enter next year. And so this is not controversial among the broad electorate. But unfortunately, this debate it's a little bit of that dynamic that we see with gun safety measures and with climate change, that the facts and the science are crystal clear, and the people get it, right? The people want gun safety measures. The people know that climate change is real and we have to take bold action. Bipartisan, it's not even a partisan issue. But the political system becomes paralyzed. And the same is true with housing. The people get it, but our political system is paralyzed because we have built a system for decades and decades that people are used to, that when it comes to housing is designed to fail. A system that is designed not to really avoid building enough housing, to make it long and expensive and difficult and unpredictable to build housing, to require every housing project to go through individualized, unending review, which could entail 20, 30, 50 or more community meetings. I never understood why 5 community meetings isn't enough. We've had in San Francisco projects that have gone through 50 community meetings. Projects that are zoning compliant that take 3, 4, 5, 10 years to get entitled, even though they're within zoning. And this is a system we've set up. So people sometimes demonize city council members or demonize neighborhood associations or demonize, and I don't think we should demonize, we can criticize people for taking ridiculous positions, but it's not about, there's a saying, hate the game, don't hate the players. We've created a bad system. And so yes, city council members reflect that system, and I'm a former local elected official. I was there, I get it. People in neighborhood associations who expect 5 years of process before a project is approved, because we have empowered that and said that's the system, that's what you're supposed to do. And so this is about trying to change that system, change the game so we don't have to hate the game anymore, and that's what this is about. And the numbers are very stark. We know that in the early 1960s, when we were a state of 15 million people, we produced between 250,000 and 330,000 units of housing per year. We did it the old-fashioned way. As you grew, you built more housing. And it wasn't perfect. There was too much sprawl being built, but we were at least building a lot of housing. You fast forward to 2019, 60 years later, we're now a state of 40 million people, almost tripling in size. And last year, we produced 77,000 units of housing. So almost tripling in size, and our housing production has gone down by about 75%. And last year was not a fluke. 3 years ago, we produced 85,000. 2 years ago, 80,000. Last year, 77,000. So we're supposed to be producing probably about 200,000. So we're way off by any stretch. But this narrative that, oh my God, we have all this construction happening, housing being built everywhere, is actually not true. We are going in the wrong direction. We continue to do that because of this fundamentally flawed system. We rank 49 out of 50 states in homes per capita. So for people who claim this is not a supply issue, you're a Republican if you say that it's a supply issue. It's supply side, trickle down, which is one of the most disingenuous arguments in existence, because supply and demand and supply side economics have nothing to do with each other than having the same word, supply. But people make that argument, but this is fundamentally a supply issue. And of course, we need massive subsidies for low-income housing, because the market for the foreseeable future is not going to produce housing affordable to low-income people. But we need to also be clear that the vast majority of low-income people in California live in non-subsidized housing, because for many, many, many years, this state did produce housing that low-income people might be a struggle there was some overcrowding, but people could at least afford housing, and that is changing. And so we have to resolve the supply issue and the subsidy issue for low-income residents. And so that's, I think, a lot of what's happening now in California is trying to change that flawed system to make structural reform. And part of it is the state versus the local role. Or I shouldn't say versus. It's the state, what is the state role and what is the local role and how do they complement each other? Because they don't have to be antagonistic. And we've created a system in California, and this is part of the problem, that we've created a system of pure local control for housing, which is different than every other major policy area. If I were to come in here and say, I have an idea for an education bill, we're going to repeal the California Education Code. Local control is so important. It's so mom and apple pie and American to have local control that if a school board wants to only educate its kids 50 days a year and not teach math and not use credentialed teachers, you know what? What does the state know, right? It's local control. So that's a good thing. You would laugh me out of the room. It's a ridiculous idea. We can debate what the education code should be, but no one would really, very few people would say the state shouldn't have a role in setting standards for something as crucial to the future of the state as public education. Yet that's what we do for housing. We have essentially said to cities, you do whatever you want. If you want to zone only for single family homes and ban apartment buildings in your community, go for it. If you want to only allow 5 units a year to be built, go for it. If you want to take 10 years to approve projects, go for it. If you want to ban low-income housing, have at it. It's all you, because local control is so important. And when we have passed state laws, like we did in the early 1980s, we had a flurry of laws with the Housing Accountability Act and the ADU requirements and the state density bonus. We put no teeth into them, so that cities have, including my own, San Francisco, have largely ignored those laws. So the proof is in the pudding. I'm a former local elected official. I believe in local decision-making for most things. But on this issue, on housing, our system of pure local control has failed. And it is one of the factors, in addition to Prop 13 and a few other things, that has driven the car into the ditch. So it's not about ending local control. It's about having stronger and more enforceable state standards so that a city doesn't have to worry, okay, I'm going to build all this housing, but will my neighbors build housing? Is it going to be just on me? We need to make sure there is a level playing field and everyone is doing what they need to do. We have a 3.5 million home deficit, and that's something that is equal to the deficit of the other 49 states combined. And the only criticism I've heard of the 3.5 million number is, no, it's not 3.5 million, it's 2.5 million. Literally, there were people who started attacking me and the governor, saying Gavin Newsom and Scott Wiener have said 3.5 million, but it's really 2.5 million. There, gotcha. So it's huge, and when you look at that scale and the current systems that we set up about how we zone for and approve housing, the current system, it just doesn't work at that scale. And so we have to change it. And so there are things happening in the legislature that's been happening. It started before I got there, and it's continuing now. We are finally saying, you know what, when we say you have to allow people to put ADUs in, we actually mean it. And so there's this game of cat and mouse going on right now, and we have some great legislators like Richard Bloom and Bob Wachowski and Nessie Skinner and Phil Ting and Laura Friedman, and people who are trying to really close all those loopholes, and we're starting to see an acceleration of ADU production, but that work has to continue. We're seeing efforts to streamline the process. I authored a bill 2 years ago, SB 35, to streamline approvals in cities that aren't meeting their housing goals. That it is starting to kick in, and more projects are taking it, are utilizing it. And there are cities that are embracing that, other cities like the city of Cupertino that are fighting it tooth and nail, but it's happening. And we have other streamlining as well. My own assembly member, David Chu, who's my counterpart in the assembly, chairing the Assembly Housing Committee, has done some good streamlining bills. And so we're seeing more of an effort to just make things move faster. Although to truly streamline, we're going to have to find a way to achieve peace between labor and the building industry on wages, which there was an effort. They took a run at it this year and did not succeed. Hopefully that will resume. But if that peace can happen, global agreement between labor and the building industry on wages, it will open up the door to, I think, dramatically more streamlining. So stay tuned on that, and anyone who's in a position to help influence that, please do. We've strengthened the Housing Accountability Act. Thank you. I see Brian Hanlon here, who started that with Nancy Skinner a few years ago, and we're doing some more this year to say that, you know what, when you have actually set up rules around height or bulk or design or whatever, you have to follow those rules. You can't say, well, we know we said 40-foot height limit, but we're going to give you 25 feet. We know we said 20 units in density, we're going to give you 8. Can't do that, and that's being strengthened. We are finally starting to put our money where our mouth is on affordable housing, and the state was withdrawing for a long time on funding for affordable housing, including ending redevelopment without replacing it with another tool. And that's starting to change with the bonds that we put on the ballot and the voters passed, with the permanent funding source, with the tax credit that is being funded in the budget, and that Assemblyman Chu authored for the 5th or 6th or 20th time. I think he got vetoed a few times. And then with some form of tax increment financing, which hopefully will come back if the governor will support it, to give cities more tools. So that's a positive thing. And then, of course, we have zoning reform. That's what SB 50 is, and SB 50 isn't the only zoning reform bill, but it's definitely an aggressive one. And it's to really, address the reality that one of the foundational problems we have, it's a math or geometry problem that upwards of 75% of the residential land in California is zoned single family, which is a pretty way of saying every other form of housing other than 1 unit per parcel is banned. Can't build even small multi-unit, student housing, senior housing, apartment buildings, it's all banned. And it's an incredibly inefficient form of land use, particularly in job centers and near transit, to say only 1 unit can be on each parcel. Not 2, not 3, not 20, 1 unit per parcel. It is so inherently limiting in terms of that 3.5 million number, and particularly in places like LA, San Francisco, which are very similar, that about 70% of the land is zoned either single family or 2 unit in both cities, and that's true in a lot of areas. You really inherently cap what you can build, and when you do have construction, it ends up being sprawl, because people just build further and further and further out, because you can't build enough in these areas where we should be building. And so we have, cities have had plenty of opportunity to fix this. Cities went in the wrong direction, like when LA deleted 50% of its zoned housing capacity in the 1980s. San Francisco did it in the 70s. And there's been upzoning in a lot of our cities, but it's not been at a huge scale. It's been very limited. It tends to be limited to main corridors, which is a start, but it's not nearly enough in terms of the numbers. And we have to go beyond that. And so SB 50 stands for the basic proposition that when you talk about areas near high quality public transportation or in job centers, you can't ban apartment buildings, period. You can't limit it to single family or 2 unit. You have to allow density. The bill largely defers to many local rules, largely defers to local height limits, design standards, setbacks, impact fees, and so forth, but provides a baseline standard around density in the areas where we should have density. We've worked very hard in the last year and a half with stakeholders to refine the bill. As Brian knows, it's been an endless process, but a good process. And we worked with equity housing advocates here in LA, in particular ACT LA and other groups, and really put in place probably what are the strongest tenant anti-demolition protections in existence under California law, provisions that delay implementation in low-income areas at risk of displacement, so we could have some space for local planning, and we have an inclusionary in the bill. So SB 50, last year's version 5 years ago, this bill would not have probably even gotten a hearing in the legislature, and this shows how the politics have shifted. Last year, in the first version of the bill, we at least got it to committee, and we had, we actually had a majority of the committee supporting it, and then some politics happened and we didn't, so it died in its first committee. This year, we went through 2 policy committees and got 9-1 and 6-1 bipartisan votes. And had it been allowed to come to the Senate floor, it would have passed off the Senate floor almost certainly. And so what happened with the delay in SB 50 was not a math or counting problem. It was a purely political problem where our appropriations process is not a democratic process and allows one member to delay a bill. And that's just the process we have. I'm not saying anything positive or negative about it. It's the process we have, and this is certainly not the only bill that's been ever affected by that process. So we are continuing to move SB 50 forward. We're about to announce some significant new endorsements of the bill, both in labor and among some pretty prominent elected officials. And we're going to keep working with stakeholders to refine the bill, and we look forward to that. This year, I think it's been in some ways a disappointing year in the legislature around various bills that have been sidetracked or watered down, but there's still some important measures that are moving through the legislature this year. Assemblyman Chu has a renter protection bill with a statewide rent cap and just cause protection, and that bill I know has been had a very winding path, but it is moving forward. And even though there's been some criticism that it got compromised, I mean the fact that a statewide rent cap could pass off of could get out of a committee in the Assembly, let alone pass off the Assembly floor, speaks volumes about where we are with the cost of housing in California. The politics have shifted, and so that's an important bill, and we have some other strong ADU bills and other bills as well. So I think we'll have some progress this year, but in terms of the monumental changes that need to happen in California to fix this mess, that's not going to happen this year. We're going to have to keep working to make that happen. But I'm an optimist, and I think we can get it done. It's a hard political issue because as a politician, there's every incentive in the world to focus on things where you can deliver tangible results tomorrow or in a year or in 2 years. And so for something like housing, where you're going to say, you know what, it's going to take 5, 10, 15 years to really move the dial on this, and we're going to have enormous amounts of construction, and but don't worry, down the road, things are going to be better down the road, things are going to be better for your kids. That's a hard argument to make politically, to say we're going to fix this, but it's going to be after I leave office. And that's why for elected officials, people aren't always chomping at the bit to take on super hard housing fights. But we are seeing more and more elected officials in Southern California and Northern California who are willing to take on this fight, because it is about the future of our state, whether we're going to continue to be a state that is diverse, that welcomes young people, that has space for not just wealthy people, but for middle class and low income people, and a state that has a strong economic and environmental future, and I know we can get there. So thank you very much. Yeah.
That's because I'm asking that because I think that's something that people can really understand and grab on.
And I think there are a lot of variables at play there. And keep in mind, SB 50, is not the silver bullet. It is one piece of the puzzle. It also is dependent on, we need to make sure that, we have faster approval process, for example, that we grapple with some of the cost issues. For example, that we have a shortage of construction workers that's causing a lot of real challenges. Are labor and the building industry able to come to an agreement on wages? Because that will facilitate and speed things up. Are we going to continue to try to do what this federal administration is doing to block immigration, which undermines the construction workforce, because that's a workforce that historically has had a lot of immigrants who are coming to the country. Used to be a lot of Irish. Today it's a lot of folks from Latin America. And that it's a real problem. Are we going to continue to see the cost escalations for materials, which we're seeing in part because of the tariffs? And so there are a lot of variables. There has been modeling about, especially in different cities, about what different supply might mean for rents and for costs. But I think it would be speculative to talk about what the exact cost is going to be in a particular community if this, that, or the other bill goes in. But we do know that in cities that have built a lot of housing, cost pressures do begin to go down, rents stabilize, and then begin to go down. There's still, if they become outrageously high and they stabilize and go down a little bit, obviously they're still really high. So that's why it's a long-term situation. But I don't think we can say exactly what the rent is going to be. Yeah, I think it is changing a lot. And I think what happened was, so back in the day when we were building a lot of housing, there were also bad things that were happening, and we had some of that housing was sort of bad sprawl that was covering up, areas that we should not be covering up. Some of it was in San Francisco. We went through a nightmare called the original form of redevelopment, where entire neighborhoods were demolished, and there were plans to demolish other ones. When I tell people, they knocked down a lot of the Western Addition and South of Market. They were planning to knock down the Haight-Ashbury and DuBose Triangle, for people who know San Francisco, which is hard to even envision. It was really bad, and then put freeways everywhere in the city, and there was a revolt. And I think that it became, because of that history, it was the progressive thing to do was to oppose development. The developers were evil, that there were these terrible things happening. It was all going to be about demolition. It was all going to be about tearing down neighborhoods. And I understand why people sort of came up in that atmosphere, because terrible things were happening that were giving development a very justifiable bad name. But then over time, that translated into, okay, it's progressive to oppose infill development, 2 blocks from a BART station or from a subway station, right? And so at some point, I think that went too far. It got away from the roots of justifiably opposing horrific, terrible forms of development or redevelopment to all development is evil, all developers are evil, and it's progressive to oppose new housing development. And so I think that's just one of the factors at play. It's not the only factor, but one of the factors. But I think that's changing a lot. And we see it on the polling, not just on SB 50, but other housing issues. You see it in the rise of the YIMBY movement, which YIMBYs sometimes get tarred by some people. But I know a lot of YIMBYs in a lot of parts of California, and these are some of the most uber lefty people I know. A lot of Bernie Sanders supporters, a lot of self-described democratic socialists who are also YIMBYs. So I think that it's gotten a lot more a lot more, it's a different dynamic, let's put it that way.
Okay, one more. Yes, Becky.
Fred Silva with California Forward. There is this big distinction between the amount of entitled units at about 130,000 a year and growing, and the numbers that are actually built, which is the 77,000 that you mentioned. Much of that is because of the two big fires. But how is it that the legislature can focus on closing that gap so that as communities are in fact entitling more units, but those units simply aren't being built? Well, what can be done as chair of the housing committee to try to get that gap closed?
Yeah, I think, well, that gap, it comes from several different causes. So for example, in San Francisco, we have tens of thousands of units that have been entitled as part of just a few mega projects like Treasure Island, the Shipyard, Park Merced, and some of the mega projects, which are large numbers of units, require the building of an entire new neighborhood. All of the sewer and the water, it's just everything. You're not just building housing, so that takes time, and it's never as fast as we want. So that's one piece of it. The cost issues are also real, and we know it's on a regular basis. I hear projects that have been entitled, and then it turns out they no longer pencil out, whether it's because of the very, very large load of impact fees of all really good and important things that in aggregate end up putting a huge cost on the project, plus the cost of labor, plus the cost of materials, and everything adds up, and then it no longer pencils. We had a project in San Francisco recently where it was a fully entitled project, pretty significant, and they decided it didn't pencil anymore, so they sold it to the city of San Francisco, which is going to build a project there. And so it's a combination of things. I think sometimes there's a narrative that, and are there developers who entitle a project and then sit on the entitlement in the hope of selling it? Yes, there are some. I don't think that that's the dominant reason that that's happening. I think it's a mix of things. I think it's incumbent on us to try to get the costs down, to try to make sure that when someone says, okay, this project pencils, I'm going to do it, that it doesn't take 5 years to entitle it so that the costs have now skyrocketed and it no longer pencils. If it pencils when a developer proposes it, we should make sure that it continues to pencil, and that's whether it's an affordable housing nonprofit developer or a private developer. But even if you look at all the entitlements that have not been built yet in California, it's still dramatically smaller than what we need.
That's all. Thank you, Senator Scott. All right, thanks everyone. We're going to have lunch now. We'll take a break. Members, we have a members' lunch down the hall. If anybody here would like to be a member and join us in the members' lunch, please see Ethan Elkind right down here in the front. He'll sign you up. For everybody else, lunch is going to be right out here in the courtyard. So feel free to grab your lunch and just hang out. We'll resume at 12:45.